Welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here so early. For some of you, extremely early, um, to this roundtable, Is Sex Passé? I just want to, at the outset, in addition to thanking all of the panelists, who I'll say a little bit about in just a second, thanking my fellow panelist, Chris Brew, for helping to co-organize this. Actually did a lot of the heavy lifting here. So we're going to go in the order of the program, and I'm going to start by introducing everybody. I'll save myself for last, even though unfortunately I'm speaking first. So I'll introduce the panelists in the order of the online program rather than alphabetically. So I guess I'll start with me. I'm Russell Spriglia. I'm assistant professor of English at Seton Hall in New Jersey. I'm the author of a number of journal articles and book chapters on American literature and literary and critical theory, as well as the editor of the books Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Literature But Were Afraid to Ask Zizek with Duke. Another book co-edited with Slavoj Zizek, Subject Lessons, Hegel, Lacan, and the Future of Materialism. And I'm currently working on completing a monograph titled A Gainful Loss, Melville avec Lacan. Our second speaker, Christopher Brew, is professor of English at Illinois State University, where he teaches classes in contemporary literature and critical and cultural theory. He's the author of the books Insistence of the Material, Literature in the Age of Biopolitics from Minnesota, and Hard-Boiled Masculinities, also both from Minnesota. Noir Affect, also, your edited collections, Minnesota, right? Okay, all from Minnesota. And he's currently working on a monograph entitled In Defense of Sex, which I think we're going to get a little bit of a preview of today, which argues for the need to supplement recent theories of the multiplicity of gender with a non-binary account of biological sex. Okay. Our next speaker will be Kieran Wachter-Green, who's assistant professor of liberal arts at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, with an emphasis on African-American literature and gender and sexuality studies. She is guest editor of At the Limits of Desire, Black Radical Pleasure, which is a special issue of the Black Scholar journal celebrating its 50th anniversary. And she also sits on the journal's active editorial board. Her academic writing has been published in the journals including African-American Review, Black Scholar, Callaloo, Feminist Formations, and Legacy, as well as various edited collections. And she's currently working on a manuscript titled Into the Scorpion Garden, Samuel R. Delaney and Transgressive African-American Literature.
That's the old title, but the new title is new title Secret. To be revealed later.
We'll find it out later. That's good. Next, Lee Edelman is the Fletcher Professor of English Literature at Tufts University. He's published widely on theory, literature, and film, and is, of course, the author of a number of books, and the most notable ones, I think, being No Future, Queer Theory and the Death Drive, with Lauren Berlant, Sex or the Unbearable. And he just recently finished a forthcoming book, which, like the other two that I've just mentioned, will also be with Duke, titled Bad Education, Why Queerness Teaches Us Nothing. That's supposed to come, it's later this year, right, Lee? I saw that.
It is this somewhere. Year. Yes.
Okay, and then let's see. Wait, is Patricia? Okay, Alenka Zupancic is research advisor at the Institute of Philosophy of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts in Ljubljana, Slovenia, as well as professor of philosophy and psychoanalysis at the European Graduate School. Among her, these are just English language publications, over 30 articles and book chapters, as well as many books, including most notably, at least for this panel, I would say What is Sex, MIT 2017, and Ethics of the Real, Kant and Lacan, with Verso. And with Slavoj Zizek and Mladen Dolar, she's editor of the Short Circuit book series at MIT Press. And also, I just found out the author of a forthcoming book on Antigone. And then, Patricia, this is the old version. I'm so sorry. Patricia, I have it here somewhere. You know what? I'm going to introduce Patricia before her talk so that I can actually get the proper introduction. I'm so sorry about that. I don't know what happened with this. Okay, so let me lead things off, unfortunately. And the title of this short talk is going to be Sex as a Hauntological Factor. As a Lacanian, I find that theoretically, there's very little I can say about sex that hasn't already been said much more eloquently and much more authoritatively by many of my fellow Lacanians, including a number of the members of this very panel. Indeed, my thinking on the subject, it's so indebted to the work of those like Alenka Zupancic, Lee Edelman, along with Joan Kopchak, Slavoj Žižek, that my aim here, it's not going to be to present any sort of original position regarding sex and psychoanalysis, but rather to first and foremost try to synthesize some of the recent work done by Lacanians in particular, and even more particularly those I've just mentioned, to think sex as an ontological factor, to riff on a Žižekian turn of phrase. To think that is sex's ontological significance, sex's bearing on being, especially, though not exclusively, human being. A development which hopefully I'll get to a little bit at the end is related, though not reducible to the current ontological and materialist turns in literary and critical theory. So that's going to be my first, primary aim, to try to briefly synthesize some of this work. And then my second aim will be to even more briefly suggest will probably be more like it, why such thinking, however, ontologically informed or materialist in nature it may be, and it is, why it's likely to be considered passé, in line with the panel's title, erroneously so, I would insist, by many adherents of these, let's call them, for simplicity's convenience sake, new ontologies and materialisms. But okay, let me first synthesize, or attempt to synthesize, some of the more fundamental claims that the four aforementioned Lacanians, and two of whom we have with us, have made with respect to sex and ontology, all of which I would say concern the role that sex plays in interpolating what we call human being into that excessive acephalous entity that psychoanalysis designates subject. Okay, perhaps Joan Kopchak puts it most perspicuously when, in an essay titled The Sexual Compact, she explains that, quote, "It is through its theory of sex, later also elaborated as drive, that psychoanalysis universalizes human nature as that which has no nature, or whose nature is radically plasticized," end quote. But then Kopchak goes on to elaborate, in contrast to the currently regnant understanding of sex as some sort of property or predicate of the subject upon which its identity is founded or grounded, psychoanalysis understands sex as that which, and this is Kopchak, quote, "expropriates the subject from herself, that which de-sequesters her interiority by linking it to jouissance," end quote, which is, of course, the perverse enjoyment that propels the subject beyond the pleasure principle, rendering the human condition that of, this is, as Žižek inimically puts it, at the outset of the sublime object of ideology. I always cite this, but it never loses its force for me, at least for me, maybe for others. Rendering the human condition that of, quote, "an animal sick unto death, an animal extorted by an insatiable parasite." I like to say insatiable parasite at 8:40 in the morning. That's good. Hence, Lee Edelman's characterization of sex in his book with Lauren Berlant, Sex or the Unbearable, as, quote, "an encounter with what exceeds and undoes the subject's phantasmatic sovereignty." So an encounter with non-sovereignty, with that which, quote, "disorganizes accustomed ways of being." And more so for Lee than for Lauren, that the agent of this non-sovereignty that disorganizes being is, of course, the death drive and the inexorable jouissance that it generates. As Lee has more recently reflected on the question of sex and ontology, and I don't know if this is I don't think it's in print yet, maybe it is, but this is from the version that he gave as a keynote at the most recent LAC conference in 2019. I like this formulation. reflecting on, his earlier point about the unbearability of sex, he says that this unbearability stems from, quote, the blow to ontological stability struck by encountering the existence of the real, that is sex. And with the term existence, X-E-X dash is so existence, which is, sort of Lacanese for what Alenka Zupancic characterizes as the out of beingness of being that is sex. So to pull a few lines from Alenka, as she cautions at the outset of her book, What is Sex? Quote, it would be a big mistake to consider that in Freudian theory, the sexual is the ultimate horizon of the animal called human, a kind of anchor point of irreducible humanity. For on the contrary, sexuality for those working in the Freudian field is the operator, quote, of the inhuman, an operator of dehumanization. And this inhuman, dehumanizing operator, again, is the death drive and the jouissance that is its sort of undead byproduct and affective supplement. As Zupancic elaborates, this is another quote, psychoanalytic theory conceives of sexuality as something which fundamentally disorients the human being, as a factor of radical disorientation that uproots the subject from the immediacy of her being, thereby bringing into question all our representations of the entity called human being, end quote. So here we've come full circle, really, for I take this to be another articulation of Kopchak's point that psychoanalysis or sex for psychoanalysis universalizes human nature as that which has no nature, right? Whose nature is radically plasticized. Or, and this is sort of my last example, as Zizek has put it in one of his more recent books, Sex and the Failed Absolute, quote, the central Freudian premise, the implicit hypothesis underlying the entire Freudian revolution is that, and this is a point that's a hypothesis further radicalized by Lacan, is that, quote, sex is our point of breaking with nature, the space where we confront ontological incompleteness, what in his language of sexuation, Lacan would term the not all of being, or being's not all. So we get caught, our point of sex is our point of breaking with nature, the space where we confront ontological incompleteness and get caught in the endless self-reproducing loop in which the aim of desire is not its goal, but the reproduction of its lack. So this is why Zizek is careful to remind us it's a fundamental point. A certain activity or process can be said to be sexualized when its goal, he says, is, quote, exempted from the domain of the possible and becomes impossible to achieve. I mean, in a word, becomes real in the Lacanian sense. So that satisfaction is not brought about by reaching it, but by the very process of repeatedly failing to achieve it. And this, this is why it's this precise sense in which, psychoanalysis considers sexuation, that which, distinguishes human being from animal. It's not any positivist sense, right? Like you can't ground it in, say, the fact that humans only enjoy sex for, or have sex for pleasure. It's not true, right? Someone will say, well, dolphins have sex, right? It's not in a positive sense that sexuation distinguishes man from animal. It's in the sense of giving rise to what Zizek characterizes as a point of impossibility designated by Freud and Lacan as das Ding, the impossible, real, ultimate point of desire, both the pursuit and the plague of which, to hearken back to the sublime object of ideology, renders human being as such, nature sick unto death. This is also Zizek, derailed, run off the rails through fascination with a lethal thing. Thing, capital T, as in das Ding. Okay, so for all of these Lacanians then, sex isn't merely a category of ontological relevance. Rather, in its disorienting and uprooting of the subject from the immediacy of its being, that's Alenka, in its expropriation and I can't even pronounce its desequestering of the subject from itself, thereby plasticizing human nature. That's Kopchak. In its existence as the negativity that disorganizes and undoes accustomed ways of being, stripping the subject of its phantasmatic sovereignty. That's Lee Edelman. Sex constitutes an ontological problem in and of itself, is itself, as Zupancic puts it, a point of ontological inconsistency or lapse, an ontological crack that haunts being from within, that informs it. And here, and I think I'll end with this just for the sake of time, to finally come to the pun in my title. I can't resist the temptation to try to appropriate the term hauntology from Derrida, because this deployment of it makes much more sense to me, I think, to speak of sex as hauntological, that which haunts human being by virtue of, and this is another Lacanianism, its extimate nature. The term extimate or extimacy being Lacan's coinage for a relation of intimate exteriority that exists between the subject and Das Ding. A relation wherein Das Ding, though it remains utterly foreign, recalcitrant, inassimilable, is nonetheless situated at the very heart of the subject, right? It's that which is in the subject more than the subject itself, as Zizek often puts it, channeling Lacan. So, I'll just conclude by saying that, one of the reasons that thinking sex ontologically here, even though it does touch upon the materialist and ontological turns, obviously may be considered a passé move, erroneously, I think, passé, is because to think sex in the psychoanalytic sense is ineluctably to think subject and to think subjectivity, which is the very sort of entity or phenomenon that much of new materialist object-oriented ontology thought is trying to expunge, or at least like dethrone and decenter from focus in ontology. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and hand the floor over to Chris. Chris, you're muted.
There we go. Okay. Hey, thank you, Russ. Forgot about that. Thank you, Russ, and thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure to be in dialogue with a bunch of people I very much respect and admire, and it's great to have such an audience at this early hour. Thank you. And I want to say a couple things, and I won't go on too long because I want to make sure that we have a short amount of time to present. I want to make sure there's time for questions and comments. But just really quickly, one thing I want to acknowledge and honor was that Lauren Berlant was supposed to be part of this panel initially, and I miss her presence almost every day, as her intellectual presence almost every day. I think about what she's taught me in various ways and in her writing, and so I just want to mention that. Also, I'm going to be the one who probably is really provocative here, and I'm actually going to I'm actually going to be the person who is talking about is fucking passé, among other things. And so so we'll see. We'll see what that does, and I might get some heat back the other way. But it's intended to be provocative. This is also taking. Russ is right that my new book is actually both about sex as embodiment and also sex as a non-binary embodiment. So it's about intersex, among other things, and it's also about sex as desire, because people kept asking me about sex as desire, and I was like, all right, I'll write about that too. And so you're going to get a little bit of that part of this piece, and it's also a dialectical argument, and unfortunately, dialectics take time. So what you're going to get instead is more like a provocation. So without further ado, I move forward. And my subtitle may be the most provocative thing here. So anyway, I'm going to stick with it, even though I think I might get heat for it. So all right, in defense of sex against micro-identities, defending sex as desire. Why would sex need defending in the present? At first glance, it is everywhere, from sexed up advertising, the ubiquity of porn, the availability of various kinds of hookups and arrangements made even more frictionless via various dating apps. We also have a proliferation of different sexualities, orientations, and desires, from pansexuality and different kinds of kinks and fetishes to various identities built around different relationships to desire, including asexuality, demisexuality, aromanticism, to name only a few. Rather than a culture built around sexual repression, control, and exclusion, which was the basic thesis of most liberatory struggles around sex and gender and sexuality in the 20th century, from sex-positive feminism to queer theory and activism, we now seem to live in a culture in which one can't escape sex. Yet cultural attitudes towards sex have changed in the present. And I can give you examples in the Q&A if you want. I don't really have a lot of them here, or any of them really. One maybe. Yet cultural attitudes towards sex have changed in the present. What Gila Ashtor terms erotophobia informs the theory, both theory and popular discourses. To take just one example, in discussing sexual issues in the classroom with friends, both younger and older, I often hear the word sexualized invoked as a negative term. Certainly our relationship to sexuality does come from locations outside or in tension with the conscious subject. And this goes back to what Russ was talking about, whether it be from cultural coding, which what Jean Laplanche theorizes as the implantation of sexuality from the adult other, drives that exist in what Jacques Lacan terms an extimate relationship with the subject, i.e. an intimate exteriority, or from the workings of fantasy as it shapes these other materials. So the idea of sexualization is not wrong. The culture sexualizes you. You are inserted, often against your conscious will or choice, into various sexualizing discourses, practices, and representations. What is missing from this account, however, is any recognition that one's relationship to sexuality is subjectified, initially retroactively, and that's the status of Nachtraglichkeit, and we can talk about that. What's missing from this account, however, is any recognition that one's relationship to sexuality is subjectified, initially retroactively, and with this subjectification comes an active, responsible, although not fully a gentle relationship to sexuality. The contemporary concept of sexualization as an external force has a grounding in Foucault's critique of the repressive hypothesis. It's central to 20th century struggles around sex, particularly as articulated in relationship to accounts of sex framed within Marxism, psychoanalysis, and the group of struggles that went under the reductive banner of sexual liberation, was the notion of sex shaped by cultural repression. Foucault's argument against the notion of repression and for positive power as central to the production of sex and sexual subjectivities represented a major turning point and break. The discourse of sexualization represents one development of this framework. Sex is a productive discourse that generates selves, bodies, and pleasures. In this sense, it is literally sexualizing. However, even as the productive hypothesis came to replace the repressive hypothesis in a lot of queer and feminist work of the 1990s, it was still linked often to a sex-positive and affirmative position. Thus, queer theory often posited sex as productive of bodies, pleasures, and perversities, and it celebrated them while also attending to their ideological dimensions. Sex was productive here, but it was seen as an affirmative dimension of subjectivity and culture in progressive circles. This is a very different usage of the productive hypothesis than is often invoked in the idea of sexualization in the present. The current version of sexualization does the work of earlier feminist discourses of objectification, criticizing the way in which consumer culture presents women and to some degree and unevenly other subjective positions as objects. Yet the earlier discourse of objectification held out the concept of a more positive conception of sex. Current uses of sexualization seem to want to be free of sex altogether. The current account has brought to the fore the negativity lurking in Foucault's account of positive power. Of course, the positivity of Foucault's account was never about its results, which could indeed be constraining and negative. But it is striking that sexualization here seems to be about producing a negative state that is predicated on an earlier moment of non-sexualization or desexualization, if not innocence. Okay, hold on real quick. Everybody can hear me, right? You're following me? Yeah, okay. Just wanted to check in. All right. That would be ridiculous if I was going on to myself. All right. The current account has brought to the fore the negativity lurking in Foucault's account of positive power. Of course, the positivity of Foucault's account was never about its results, which could indeed be constraining and negative. But it is striking that sexualization here seems to be about producing a negative state that is predicated on an earlier moment of non-sexualization or desexualization, if not innocence. The sex positivity of the 1990s has shifted to what can only be described as the strange sex negativity of the present moment, in which sex is both ubiquitous and everywhere a threat. Given this emphasis in the present, It is perhaps not surprising that one of the most dynamic bodies of theory to have emerged in the past 10 years or so is around asexuality, which importantly attends to the conscriptive and violently compulsory dimensions of sexuality in the present, while also affirming a position of, while also affirming a positive notion of asexuality as a lived subjectivity and relationality. Accounts of asexuality do not have to be erotophobic. Indeed, they can be central to producing a more affirmatively elective relationship to sex and sexuality. But in a decent number of asexuality's more popular invocations, it seems to be want to be rid of sex altogether. This attitude towards sex in the present has seemingly rendered it not only ubiquitous, but a ubiquitous problem. Sex, at least in terms of how we talk about it, and as Foucault and Lacan argue in what we can posit as a rare moment of agreement, sex is as much about discourse as it is about acts. Anyway, sex, at least in terms of how we talk about it, has stopped being primarily about pleasure, sensuality, desire, relationality, and the ecstatic ambivalence of jouissance. It is something we do. It is not something we do, but something that is done to us. The way in which it complicates or negates our egoic conceptions of self increasingly presents itself as a problem. If it represents a breach of our egoic self, a complex and risky grappling with the otherness of both oneself and one's lovers, this breach itself is presented as traumatic. Of course, powerful and necessary recent work on the pervasiveness of sexual violence in contemporary cultures, articulated by Me Too in the US and in many other national contexts, demonstrates that sex is too often bound up with trauma. It is too often used as a tool of oppression, exploitation, and non-consensual violence. Yet in recognizing this reality and working to transform it, it is crucial that our theories of sex don't capitulate by making sexualization the dominant or even sole way in which we conceptualize sex to the very ideology that we are trying to undo. The critique of the understanding of sex is everywhere seen about reinforcing unequal and non-consensual forms of power was central to the queer sex-positive positions of late 20th century thinkers like Gail Rubin, Susie Bright, and Amber Halliwell, just to name three. They, in turn, were responding to the foundational accounts of the centrality of rape and sexual violence to the maintenance of patriarchy by Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin. In order to produce a pro-sex position that doesn't just become another sexual libertarianism or a justification of patriarchal business as usual, which is arguably the fate of certain aspects of the pro-sex movement of the 1990s and 2000s, we need to maintain both sets of insights at once. More than the unintentional effects of necessary struggles around sexual violence, however, I think that the roots of the reconceptualization of sex as a problem, one that traumatically sexualizes one, is more directly related to transformations in subjectivity produced by neoliberalism and the uneven mediation of much of our sense of self through the ever-changing lens of social media and online culture more generally. Central to neoliberalism, as thinkers as diverse as Foucault, Wendy Brown, and David Harvey have argued, is the notion of human capital. In place of collective notions of shared subjectivity produced by a shared yet unequal access to the public sphere as a locus of collective rights and responsibilities, all of which are part of the long legacy of Fordism for all its contradictions, and the powerful forms of feminist, gay, and anti-racist struggles of the 1960s and 70s. Our current society promotes a thoroughly individualized notion of one's relationship to the social, one that depends on how much human capital one has amassed. Human capital assumes that all aspects of human existence can be regulated and sorted by the market. In place of the society as a locus of collective responsibility, positive liberty, and the possibility of collective flourishing, we instead have a collection of competing individuals whose right to social and economic goods depends on their individual performance of wealth, ability, health, morality, and recognition. In place of a social contract, however inadequate and bisected by the contradictions of capitalism, we instead have the imperative towards self-branding. You need to be on brand, as the ironic internet lingo has it. An imperative towards self-branding, self-promotion, and an individualist understanding of identity as personal property. Identity, once a category of collective organizing and identification, becomes primarily personal. Online, it often becomes a source of social capital, in which legitimate arguments around exploitation, oppression, and exclusion regularly morph into competing claims of greater marginality or authority, or marginality as authority, and lead to the proliferation of various and competing identity claims, including by members of groups who are already thoroughly privileged. I'm not arguing that subject positions and experience don't matter. I am arguing that we need to be able to create forms of solidarity and relationality that transcend the increasingly micrological and local understandings of identity in addressing fundamental social and economic inequalities. Within this context, it is not surprising that one's relationship to sex itself has been fundamentally transformed for many people. As I argued above, sex is increasingly seen as something both ubiquitous and alien. It impinges on one identity and threatens to negate it. And while most psychoanalytic and constructivist accounts may locate the initial locus of sex outside the subject, crucial to earlier accounts is the way in which we subjectify this relationship in all of its ambiguity and contradiction. Sex as a necessary relationship to the self and to the other is lost in the present. It constructs the other and the social as a threat to the ascendancy of one's identity and the careful cultivation of human capital. Sex has the uncomfortable taint of otherness, of other people, of the ghost of the social. It is also disruptive, disorienting, and undoing of all the careful work one puts into presenting your best self. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to go. My talk is, I think, well aligned with yours. And I want to apologize because the steam heat in my radiators just kicked in here in freezing Chicago. So you might hear a lot of hissing in the background. So apologies in advance. Thank you, Russ and Chris, for organizing this panel. And thank you everyone for being here and to my fellow panelists. The title of my brief remarks today is On Whose Back? Sex Work, Sex Labor, Sexual Praxis. So generally, when we ask whether sex is or is not passé, we mean whether sex is passé in theory. Specifically, though, in theorizations where sex acts and labor do not directly inform our answers. In this talk, I am drawing upon years of interviewing predominantly Black femme professional dominatrixes and femme dominatrixes or DOMs of color who work with and within race and gender-based asymmetrical power dynamics and scenarios of desired and consensual fear, violence, pleasurable pain, and humiliation. And one of the concerns of this panel and the special journal issue that's going to be emerging from it, and Chris, you just spoke to this, is that the necessary critique of sexual violence that has been central to Me Too has also had the unintended effect of backgrounding more sex positive discourses, including those that intentionally play and work with pain and negativity, which yes, can be sex positive, and oppression. And here I'm thinking specifically of forms of edge play, and edge play are kinky acts that are considered risky within the kink community. So, you know, things such as race play or consensual non-consent. These types of relations are considered, or, you know, particularly looked askance at in this moment that I consider, and that many seemingly on this panel also consider to be a pretty sex conservative climate. So I'm always wary of demonizing practices of relation in the name of protectionism, especially when risky interactions can be, to quote the panel organizers, shattering and reorienting in manners that extend far beyond the personal or the individual. So in short, I'm interested in continuing to think about how some kinky practices form sex theory that is tied to the contradictions of the social. And so I'm building upon Ariane Cruz's groundbreaking work in her 2016 book, The Color of Kink, in which she uses BDSM as a metaphor for Black women's sexuality, as well as Margot Weiss's 2011 Techniques of Pleasure, in which she critiques San Francisco's BDSM scene as reaffirming neoliberal capitalist pleasure circuits. And in the article version of this talk that I'm going to be developing, I'm going to be focusing on DOMs who, through the scenic construction of enacted fantasy, in which they make sex an organized critical activity, they produce the ground that inspires explicit sex theory. But the DOMs who I am in conversation with articulate a sex theory that is perhaps contrary to Cruz's and Weiss's formulations, because together, what they are articulating in these interviews is speaking to identitarian defamiliarization, disillusionment, and anti-capitalism. And so I'll just quote a bit from an interview I did last May with a New York City-based pro-dom. Her name's Goddess Aaliyah. So now this is her words and her voice. She says, "It's almost amusing how socially enforced power dynamics are, both deeply rooted yet terribly unstable. They rely on so many congruent levels of cooperation and adherence that it's really easy to cause a slight disruption and throw them off balance, even momentarily. It's all hanging by a thread, and everyone's either terrified of it falling apart or eagerly awaiting its destruction, like me. Radicalization is my fantasized end goal for my submissives, which to me centers on the objective of holistic anti-capitalism, as opposed to a superficial goal of anti-racism and feminism. Since I'm constantly working toward this myself, I know how endless the process is. It doesn't happen overnight by self-flagellating between chapters of white fragility. It also doesn't happen within a 2-hour BDSM scene. My realistic goal for subs is defamiliarization and disillusionment. And here Aaliyah is talking about, you know, long-term, outside of the dungeon, outside of the space of the BDSM scene. So I'm continuing in her words, I'm quoting her still. She says, trying to understand these systems and power dynamics at a critical level takes endless unlearning and relearning. But it starts with the initial dissatisfaction that inspires lifelong examination and reevaluation. This kind of rediscovery isn't usually sought after by people who don't consider it a survival skill. It's uncomfortable and painful, which are welcomed and encouraged feelings within BDSM. So I hear in Goddess Aaliyah's words that she wants those who disavow social pressure towards sexual and power reorientation to need defamiliarization, to desire identitarian disillusionment, and to stake the survival of their psyches on it. Because the racial, class, and gender-based status quo is unsustainable, including, and this is her point, for those who seemingly benefit from a position of privilege in mainstream culture. So for a dom such as Goddess Aaliyah, hers is kinky labor with intention towards disintegration, and it demands critical examination of, to quote kinky queer theorist Juana Maria Rodriguez, a coming undone predicated by coming together. So something I'm still thinking through is how kinky enactment or praxis, meaning the process by which a lesson or skill is embodied, realizes or manifests a theory. And I'm going to be looking back at my many interviews I've done, as well as the archival research I did at Chicago's Leather Archives and Museum when I was the visiting scholar there in 2018, researching Black women's myriad historical and contemporary involvement in leather fetish and kink communities. But I'll just offer a few more thoughts here. As Cruz and Rodriguez and Samuel R. Delaney remind us, just to name a few kinky queer theorists, so many fantasies are risky. They're unspeakable, and this is what makes them hot, right? They can be shameful to admit, even to oneself, possibly because they're rendered disgraceful by society, or they're steeped in horrific national histories of racism and gender-based violence, so much so that the material feels untouchable as erotic fodder for personal stimulation, much less for material enactment with another person. But of course, some of the fantasies pro-doms enact for and with their subs regularly dwell purposefully and with intention and consent in these very spaces of eroticized violence. And here I would turn people to Cruz's important work on race play. The labor of some forms of sex work as sex theory is in part constructing and staging fantasy so that it's tethered as if with additional cords to the real, keeping the most vulnerable of fantasy scenarios from collapsing under the weight of their prohibitions. But here, rather than quote Lacan, I want to reference Rodriguez again, who states, to deny our fantasies because they're too complicated, too painful, or too perverse to erase their presence or censor their articulation in public life constitutes a particular kind of insidious violence that threatens to undermine our ability to explore the contours of our psychic lives and the imaginary possibilities of the social worlds in which we exist. And that's from her 2011 article, Queer Sociality and Other Sexual Fantasies. In considering some spaces of articulated kinky fantasy as forming the grounds of sex theory, I'm thinking about the etymological foundation of theory as deriving from the Greek word theorian, to look at, as one looks at a theater stage. In kink, one has to observe, consider, and contemplate one's defamiliarizing fantasies with the intention to join with another, in many cases with a pro-dom, to stage the highly circumscribed and heavily negotiated theater of sexual or sexually adjacent kinky play. And I draw attention to sex adjacent because not all kink manifests through sex acts. And to do this in a way that the fantasy can be heard and responded to as the player's desire, there needs to be, and here I'm quoting Delaney from his 92 article on the unspeakable, there needs to be the proper rhetorical flourishes. And kinky theater, it's of course replete with theatrical scene-specific ritualized costumes and props and language. Sex workers and their clients are enacting the fantasy outside of the mind and making it manifest, which requires intentionality with power exchange. Who has power, who is given power, who willingly relinquishes it, how, and how is it fluidly and or rigidly wielded. Kink is highly considered and structured, and this is one of the reasons why Weiss claims BDSM is not as transgressive as many think it is. It's a space created in response to the articulation of fantasy. Ground is cleared, a stage is set with specific rules and conventions governing the players and their modes of relation. And these rules and conventions are captured in kinky acronyms. So for a long time, we had SSC, which is safe, sane, consensual. And more recently, the acronym is RAC, which is risk-aware consensual kink. And that's just a move away from the pathologizing of sane, as well as these kind of specious claims towards safety, and more towards an emphasis on educating oneself about risk and consenting accordingly. My research has crucially shown me that there are many contradictions within kink communities. For many of the DOMs I speak with, they see their work with its intention towards radical restructuring of the social as forms of liberation and reparations. And while much of this is what I'll be exploring in the article, to be clear about my investments and kind of where I distinguish my own interests, I'm interested in kink in addition to and beyond therapy or the processing of trauma. And one of the reasons why I find kink so important and generative is because it provides, among so many things, a way of embodying and performing deeply unsettling and seemingly inappropriate modes of thinking, being, and relating without healing, having to be the necessary purpose or end goal. And so I'm seeking always to locate what, if anything, remains risque in the ever-creeping passé. And I aim to stay in the space of unreconcilable contradiction. And these values are aligned with the practices of legendary kinky Black submissives, including Viola Johnson and Molena Williams-Haas, but the work of Black subs is a conversation for another time. So I'll just end by saying, whether dom or sub, for kinky Black women who contend with material and epistemological race and gender-based violence in their everyday lives, there are few public civilian, and by civilian I just mean non-kinky, few public and civilian spaces to openly, or at least in a nuanced manner, explore the texture and weight of these histories as they inform sexual fantasy. And both Johnson and Williams-Haas, in addition, of course, to Cruz, have written and spoken extensively about this. For anyone who is socially marginalized for any number of reasons, to express curiosity about pleasure in archives of pain is explicitly and implicitly discouraged outside of kink, especially given the dominance of trauma discourse. So I ask, what else can kink offer theoretically in regards to, and here I end with Rodriguez's words, the untamed erotics of multiply inflected power relations? Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, Lee
Great.
Edelman is
Yep.
next.
Thank you all, fellow panelists. It's an honor to be here, and I'm just going to launch into my talk in the interest of saving time. The answer to the question posed by this panel depends on one's reading of sex. And to that extent, our title looks back to the question Alenka Zupancic treats so brilliantly in What is Sex?, a book that takes its own title from the author's Prosopopoeia of Freud. As Zupancic writes, quote, "To the Victorian screaming, sex is dirty, Freud did not answer something like, no, it is not dirty, it is only natural, but rather something like, what is this sex that you are talking about?" Unquote. With this, Zupancic reminds us that psychoanalysis engages, in her words, the quote, ontologically uncertain character of sexuality, unquote. An uncertainty we also encounter in the various meanings of the signifier, sex, denoting at once the genital organs, the so-called sexual difference to which those organs are made to attest, and the physical acts by which those organs may experience stimulation. Sex expands to figure the field of sexuality in general, and the whole of the empire founded on what we construe as sexual meaning. The language describing our panel centers on challenges to sexual difference posed by the multiplication of genders or by revisions to our theories of sexuality that the recognition of trans identities or asexuality may demand. Challenges of the sort made by Paul Preciado in Can the Monster Speak?, a book in which he foresees the passing of what we know as sex. Quote, "The epistemology of sex, gender, and sexual difference is mutating. This paradigm shift may mark the passage to an endless number of differences of bodies, of unidentified and unidentifiable desires, a proliferation of practices and forms of life, a multiplication of desires capable of unfurling beyond genital pleasure," unquote. Despite relying on the work of Foucault, however, Preciado's appeal to the possibilities that lie beyond genital pleasure retains the conceptual framework of desire that Foucault rejected as central to the subject's compelled intelligibility, and so to its capacity for regulation by taxonomic norms. Though Preciado specifically refers to desires unidentified and unidentifiable, those desires still attest to the subject's truth through translation into, quote, practices and forms of life, unquote, that authorize the monster to speak. Quote, "The monster is one who lives in transition, one whose face, body, and behaviors cannot yet be considered true within a predetermined epistemic regime," unquote. Presenting himself specifically as the monstrous offspring of psychoanalytic discourse and clinical practices, the offspring precisely of what Foucault construes as the discourse of desire, Preciado speaks to hasten the end of the reign of sexuality that keeps his truth from becoming intelligible. Noting the difficulty of living, quote, outside an epistemic and political regime when a new cognitive framework, a new map of what it means to live, has not yet been collectively agreed, unquote. Preciado anticipates a new regime that will confirm the truth he lives, and he solicits his audience to attend to his speech if, within the current regime, it can, quote, listen to a non-binary body and afford it the potential for reason and truth, unquote. It is possible to acknowledge and endorse, as I do, Preciado's most emphatic assertions that what we describe as, quote, sexual difference is neither a nature nor a symbolic order, but is historical and changing, unquote. That such sexual difference has been in crisis for a while and is undergoing mutation, and that mainstream psychoanalytic practices will need to change in response. It is possible to acknowledge and endorse all this while insisting not only that the symbolic order is determined by sex nonetheless, but also that Preciado's project itself reinforces the regime of sex whose historical mutations keep its hold from ever becoming passé. That very word passé preserves the sex or the sexual logic it threatens with anachronism in our title by referring in its earliest use to the state of being, quote, past one's prime, especially of a woman, past the period of greatest beauty, no longer young, unquote. It thus correlates value with marketability in a reproductive economy, an economy of history, of generation, understood through sexual difference, where sex derives from the Latin term sexus for the categorical division of gender or sex, a word that, according to Michiel de Vaan's Etymological Dictionary of Latin, may find its roots in secere, to cut, or in secus, meaning otherwise or separate. I invoke these etymologies in the manner of Lacan, who writes in his Ethics of Psychoanalysis, quote, don't think that these etymological insights, these rapid soundings, consonant though they are with what Freud calls us back to all the time, the research, the in-depth linguistic study to recover the track of experience accumulated by generations of tradition, which is the most reliable vehicle for transmitting a formulation marking psychic reality. Don't think that this is what we would prefer to guide us by a long shot, unquote. Instead, I suggest we be guided by their relation to these lines from L'Étourdi, where Lacan conveys something crucial to sex as psychoanalysis explores it. Quote, Freud puts us on the path of that which absence designates as sex. It's through the swellings up of this sans absex that a topology spreads out where the word is determining, unquote. It was Freud, Lacan tells us here, who led us to think the designation of sex by absence, by what remains foreign to economies of meaning or sense. But the act of designation swells sex as absence chiastically into sans absex. In the sense-making order of language, that is, whatever we know as sex, whatever the epistemology that lets us know it, has positivized and in the process effaced the negativity of sex as absence. Meaning, including the meaning of sex, is always sans absex, sense procured by absenting sex. To that extent, one could argue either that sex as absence is always passé, always lost to us, inaccessible in the topology of sans absex, where the word, Lacan writes, is determining, or that sex could never, in fact, be passé, since every word is a catachresis of the absence that can never be spoken, but on which language and speech depend. The absence that pertains to the negativity of sex that precedes the entities its meaningless cut alone cuts into meaning, thus enacting, perhaps, the psychic reality of secare, to cut or to sever, as the etymon of sexus, which merely positivizes that cut. Preciado, like Lacan, refuses to accept a positivized or ontologized sexual difference as an epistemic principle. But Preciado, in this unlike Lacan, remains loyal to the regime of reason and truth, to a thinking committed to the meaning of desire, and to desire as the desire for meaning that shapes the logic of sans absex by making absence unspeakable. Can the monster speak? Of course he can. But in speaking, he betrays his status as a catachresis of monstrosity, which is also to say of the monstrosity of catachresis itself. As Paul de Man writes in the Epistemology of Metaphor, quote, something monstrous lurks in the most innocent of catachreses. When one speaks of the legs of the table or the face of the mountain, catachresis is already turning into prosopopeia, and one begins to perceive a world of potential ghosts and monsters. Unquote. The catachreses that demonstrate such monstrosity, though, can also defend against it, when their figural status, once naturalized, forms the stuff of collective reality, like the truth of sexual difference. Within this catachrestic reality, as posited by sans absex, The unnameable, the monstrosity, the outside to the field of meaning, gets projected onto catachreses of ontological impossibility, of sex as the radical negativity that occasions meaning through its preclusion. In the order of meaning, where the word is determining, où c'est le mot qui tranche, literally, where the word cuts things into being, all subjects are catachreses of a cut, of a severing, that they can never name or know. The cutting out of absence that gives linguistic entities historical identities by blinding us to their status as catachrestic figures of sex, of a negativity that is not historical. History, Paul de Man argues, is just the anamorphosis of tropes, the diachronic unfolding of elements synchronic within a linguistic structure, like the acting out of a subject whose unconscious has no conception of time. In that case, Preciado's monster as prophet of epistemic change is a passing catachresis of the monstrosity, the absence that speaks catachrestically through all of us, compelling us, like Yeats's golden bird, to sing of what is past or passing or to come, the better to deny what doesn't change, the negativity of sex as absence. Preciado is right. The meanings imposed on sex in the order of sans absex will mutate, but the subsequent meanings that take their place will continue the negation of sex as absence, as what is neither a nature nor a symbolic order, nor historical and changing. New catachreses of monstrosity will continue to emerge in the order of history, so long as subjects think that speaking makes them agents of reason and truth, instead of objects whose speech is a prosopopoeia that emerges from somewhere else, as it does for Zupancic's Freud, when he voices the question neither we nor Preciado should answer in a way that aims to make sense. What is this sex that you are talking about?
I guess it is my turn. Yeah.
Yes, Alenka.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm really glad to be part of this round table. And I will simply cut to the chase. We have very little time left, and I will try to keep my intervention very short and very simple, hopefully, in order to sketch out what I think is at stake in this question, is sex passé? So where does this question even come from? We could say, yeah, where does it come from? And what does the question form tell us? Because it's also quite fun, you know, when you ask something like, say, to be or not to be, it's quite clear that the moment you ask this question, there is only one possible answer, that is not to be. You know, Vladen Dular made this point talking about this. So it seems to suggest already something with a very question form. And I think indeed it is difficult sometimes to separate or distinguish several facets of this question, is sex passé? For what appears as a kind of statement or suggestion, it could be that sex is passé. Often, of course, hides and betrays a modality of ought to, of desire or expectation. Sex ought to be a thing of the past. We would be better off if sex were a thing of the past, or simply we should move away from sex. And of course, one of the fundamental facts about sexuality, probably first clearly articulated by Freud, is that sexuality is not simply about intimacy, but it is interwoven with the social. So social relations are at work in sexuality to a great extent. And that's why shifts in social relations often play out on the ground of sexuality as issues of sexuality and its vicissitudes. This is certainly something that we can see a lot lately, with Me Too as just one prominent example. So the question, is sex passé, could be seen as part of this configuration, part of what appears today as passionate debates about gender, its identity, plasticity, fluidity, its multiplication, or even abolition, abandonment by that very multiplication. Debates about violence, sexual violence, discrimination. And indeed, looking at the intensity of these debates, which is kind of mounting, it seems clear that all kinds of social issues, problems, and causes are articulated and fought out today as issues of sexuality. I would say that in this context and as part of these debates, the question, is sex passé, testifies to the fact that it is obviously anything but passé. It is being mobilized for all kinds of causes, also political causes. But in a way, in their own particular form, these debates also resonate strongly with the social and political debates of the early 20th century, when sex, also considered as possibly a thing of the past, was intensely involved in the debates concerning social emancipation and revolution, including the program or desire to create a new social relation and a new man, as this was phrased back then. And as Aaron Schuster pointed out, this aspiration was marked by a fundamental ambiguity. Is it sexuality that is to be liberated, delivered from moral and social prejudices and legal prohibitions, so that the drives are allowed a more open and fluid expression? Or is it humanity to be liberated from sexuality, finally freed from its obscure dependencies and tyrannic constraints? In a word, is sexuality the object or the obstacle to emancipation? And this ambiguity or this double-edged question, I think, continues in today's debate. And I think it is of utmost importance not to cast and understand this in terms of an alternative. If we do this, we end up with the following choice. Either we see sexuality as a kind of subjective problem of the social, preventing the social from functioning smoothly and harmoniously, or else we see the social as a kind of objective problem, obstacle of sexuality, repressing it, whatever, imposing on it some things, but it's always like we have two fully constituted entities in this perspective. So, and obviously the first perspective also resonates with the ideas of the post-human, with the idea that humanity is a disease and needs above all to be emancipated from humanity itself. With sexuality considered as the point where humans are most human in this perspective. Whereas the second perspective, that of the social as the objective problem of sexuality, casts the social and its problems as that which induces and causes problems in the realm of sexuality. So if I say that this is wrong alternative, it is for the following reason. It is my kind of philosophical conviction that the sexual and the social appear or take place within each other, are implicated in one another, not with what they are, not with their being, but with their non-being, with their ontological deficit precisely. They are implicated in each other with the part they lack, we could say, could paint a picture, the part that has no ontological standing or no symbolic representation. They do not complement each other. They do not bring to each other what each of them lacks. Or if taken literally, this is exactly what they do. The sexual brings to the social that which it, the sexual, lacks. And the social brings to the sexual that which it, the social, lacks. So they kind of give each other that which they don't have, and that which they do not have becomes something, acquires a being in the other, precisely at the place of this lack in the other. And I believe this singular topology is crucial to keep in mind when discussing the social dimension of the sexual and the sexual dimension of the social. They each give some form of existence to that which in the other is not. So we don't have a lot of time, so I will put this very crudely. For example, what is the scandalous aspect usually of sexuality? This is at least my claim that most of you know. What is scandalous about sexuality is not something that we can see in it, but rather something that we cannot see because it is not there. When we see, I don't know, naked bodies touching or the act of copulation, we see many, many things, but we don't see the sexual relation, as Lacan famously put it. So sexual relations certainly exist, but they exist precisely against the background of not having a pre-established automatic key, which would be the sexual relation. So sexual relation only exists as comedy or tragedy of a relation that has no pre-established key. So to return to the point I was making earlier, that of the sexual and the social giving each other what they don't have, with the latter acquiring some sort of being when placed in the other, we could perhaps say in a very simplified way, the sexual non-relation becomes in the social the combinatory of sexual roles, sexual assignments, and of their questioning. Because I also think that the emphasis on the non-binary functioning could be considered as a form of social assignment, something in relationship to this negative. On the other hand, and to some extent at least, I'm not saying that there is a symmetry here, but we could say that the social non-relation, that is to say the antagonism at the very heart of the social, also becomes something else, becomes something in the sexual, for instance, love or hateful repulsion or something like that. But of course, love does not resolve the social non-relation, no more than the social regulation of sexuality and sexual rules resolves the sexual non-relation. So, I don't know, I will simply conclude with kind of two suggestions. Perhaps we could say that the only way in which we could affirmatively answer the question, is sex passé, would be in the case that the latter were to become entirely disentangled from the social. Perhaps still existing being, but in a socially totally indifferent way. And then, of course, one could ask, is this perhaps one of the aims of psychoanalysis, to induce a kind of separation between two legs that keep nourishing each other and render as deliverers of this, or render us to some real or not? Or is this perhaps the task of politics? Because I'm really convinced that we are living in times where politics is absolutely everywhere, particularly in sex, everywhere except in politics. In politics, we only have capital management and some other things. So perhaps repoliticization of politics would also be a side way of addressing this question of is sex passé or not. But perhaps it would resolve itself. Thank you. This is all.
Thank you, Alenka. And then I'm going to skip the introduction just in the interest of saving time, because we're quickly running out of it, but and pass it over to Patricia Garavici.
Thank you. And also in the interest of time, just a big thank you. And I'm very happy to be here with you today. Start my brief presentation. If I become a woman, I'll be my real self. It's much easier for a trans woman or a trans man who authentically kind of looks and plays the role. This is Caitlyn Jenner writing in The Secrets of My Life, a book from 2017. Jenner evinces a concern for truth and authenticity that can be baffling. What is true and authentic in the realm of gender transition? Would the idea evoke Heidegger's criticism of the traditional concept of truth, seen as adequation between thought and reality? Heidegger promotes authenticity as an unconcealment predicated on the truth of Dasein's existence, being for death. Judith Butler's Gender Trouble seemed to appeal to a similar notion of authenticity when reducing gender to performance, since it was an imitation for which there was no original. However, the usual trans response to these positions has consisted in asserting an irrefutable truth of the inner self, all the more powerful as it contradicts the visual appearance of the body. Hence, the idea of realness as deployed by Janet Mock's Redefining Realness from 2014, Mock exhibits a certain proximity to Lacan's real as opposed to the symbolic and the imaginary. The real cannot be reduced to meaning, it resists symbolization and imaginary representation. Lacan's real has to be connected with the drives and entails an absence of complementarity and completion in sexuality. Amongst redefining realness, my path to womanhood, identity, love, and so much more, and surpassing certainty, that's a book from 2017, are both predicated on the idea of following a personal truth to the end. The idea of realness derives from Janice Livingston's 1990 American documentary film, Paris is Burning, the notorious chronicle of African American and Latinx gay and transgender communities in New York City. Paris is Burning documented competitions in which contestants were judged according to dance talent, beauty, and above all, realness, the ability to pass and not be read. For trans women, thus, realness is not about winning the competition, but about survival. Truly, realness becomes a matter of life and death. Mock insists that her gender strategy of survival made her vulnerable, and I quote, "Privacy wasn't even granted to a girl like me who had spent years standing out by merely being. It was the price I pay for living my truth," end quote from Sex Passé. Such an emphasis on being corresponds to my clinical experience as a psychoanalyst, working with adolescents who identify as trans. They undergo gender transition because they deal less with the problems of gender and sexuality rather than with questions of life and death. What is at stake is less gender fluidity than finding a livable embodiment, a way of being and living on, a survival at the limit. Once more, gender transition has to do with mortality, the limit between life and death, more than gender or sexuality. The wish to cross the frontier between the sexes is experienced as the desire to traverse a mortal threshold, a passage from an impending doom to a possible renaissance. What is at stake is crossing an ultimate frontier. For the adolescents who identify as trans, realness is a truth about themselves, allowing them to find an embodiment, a solution that follows Lacan's logic of the symptom. This logic, which is well known, and I hope maybe we will have time for an extra Q&A moment, leads me to, we could return to it later, leads me to state that sex is not just passé as such, more passing. In fact, provided we hear in the term a combination of realness as authentic truth beyond appearance and passing as a renewed confrontation with death. The sentence is stated in the third person, X has passed, can mean both X is dead or X has succeeded in achieving realness. On this view, sex has to move from being seen as verifiable anatomical fact, a truth localized somewhere between the legs, to being a postulation about the face. When we run into a stranger, we make a gender attribution, most likely based on the face. This means that gender is not simply an intelligible performance, as Butler argued in the 90s, but the recognition of a face, in the way Levinas presented it in Totality and Infinity. My recognition of others' existence through infinite distance requires that I let these others live as they are, that I refuse to let them die or be killed. One linguistic symptom of the recent controversies around trans-identified subjects is the word dead naming, which is considered a violent act committed by cis people when they call a trans subject with their birth or former name. The term dead naming plays on the fact that the trans rebirth posits life against death. For me, this evokes the way Frank Wilderson explains in Afro-Pessimism that the curse of slavery has not yet been lifted, that the subjugated position of African Americans prevents them from, quote, ever being regarded as human beings, end quote. This structural exclusion place them in what Orlando Patterson described as, quote unquote, social death. There is a deathliness saturating Black life. In the same way that Southern races may see in a Black person a reminder of slavery, to hark back to a birth sex considered as an inescapable fate is inflicting another form of structural violence. Racism and sexism share common structures, among which is the forceful imposition of a limit between life and death in the span between two deaths. If pre-transition trans persons feel not fully alive, the strategy of finding a livable life goes from that first death to a second death, as Griffin Hasbury has formulated it, quote, transition itself is a form of death, end quote. However, this second death paradoxically provides the condition for a potential social and psychical rebirth. If sex is linked to death and reproduction to mortality, sex speaks to a violence inside life intertwined with loss. Such loss can at times prevent any life. Against this, psychoanalysis insists, as Hegel had it, that one must look at death in the face. Psychoanalysis thereby gambles on the possibility of living through death. As T.S. Eliot wrote in The Journey of the Magi, I should be glad of another death, end quote. Thank you.
Well, I don't know how quickly, I think we're going to be kicked out pretty soon, but maybe if there is there time, we might have time for one question. If someone in the audience wants to pose a question, ask a question, either verbally or in the chat.
And thank you all for attending. I feel bad that we ran over so much, and hopefully Patricia and Alenka, you felt like you had enough time to really present what you wanted to present. So, but yeah.
Can I ask a quick question to sort of bring a theory, a non-Lacanian theory of desire into conversation here? You know, Spinoza's concept of conatus, you know, involves a desire not as lack, but desire as a kind of constantly endeavoring to be affected by the social. And I'm wondering if there's not something that brings to the conversation that allows us to take a slightly different understanding of sex as not necessarily about sort of seeking death or seeking absence or something like that, or incompleteness, but sort of like a sort of durational desire and endeavoring that always involves the social. And so to sort of think dialectically, maybe it might be worth sort of introducing that conception alongside perhaps Lacan. Oh, and also quickly, if we just ask the tech person, they usually can give you 10 extra minutes.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. Eric, to answer, from my answer to your question is, I am really interested in how sex connects to the social, and Spinoza's position is not, it's not a tradition I tend to work through. I tend to work through more of the kind of Hegelian and Lacanian, although, you know, but also queer and Marxist traditions. And so I'm interested in thinking about how sex and the social relate, but I'm interested in the contradictions they produce as much as the continuations, you know. And so for me, what often falls out of positivists, and I'm not saying that this is the Spinozist one account at all, but what falls out of positivist accounts, or purely positive accounts sometimes, like Foucault's, is the ways in which these things exist as contradictions, both on a level of the social, on the level of the subjective. And so that's what I want to hang on to there. But I agree. I think we need to think the social and the sexual together. I actually think that to the degree that we start to see a waning of the sexual as something that people define themselves to, I'm wondering if it's a waning of social relation on some level too. But that's neither here nor there. So
I may also say something, because to some extent I feel interpolated with this question. I mean, I was trying already to argue precisely against this, I mean, too simple position between lack and surplus in my What is Sex book, because this opposition between Deleuzians or Spinozians emphasizing the excessivity, the surplus in the Lacanians, supposedly just betting on the lack. I think there is a very fundamental Lacanian insight that I at least see as such, and I try to follow, which is that actually surplus, what emerges, like the being of the lack is the surplus. For me, the lack is the answer to the question why there is this surplus excessive thing that appears at some point. The way, the substance of enjoyment, so to put it, is predicated precisely on this negativity, and this is what makes it the excessive. Otherwise, ontologically, it's even difficult to express or explain why this would even be a surplus, or why something would just keep popping up at these particular places. So in any way, this is just to say that I don't think I was primarily talking about the lack today, not in the sense of lack, but precisely as, again, this what in the other is the place where the being of the other is created within the surplus. So it's a different kind of dialectics. I don't have time to explain everything now, but I would just like to insist that I really care a lot about keeping these two facets of the lack and the surplus within the same picture, as ontologically very much related, and our surplus being the very being of the lack in some way.
Yeah, I would just add there, that's to Alenka's point, that's why Lacan shifts on this, but it's why jouissance is always something that is being pursued, but not only can you never reach it, but you also just can't get rid of it. It's an indelible stain. And so it is the sort of the lack and surplus has to be thought, dialectically, insofar as right there, just what Alenka said, that it's almost as though the lack, the discussion of lack comes from the discovery of the surplus itself. Other questions, comments?
There's a question in the chat about the special issue, Russ and Chris, if you want to address that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, this is going to be a special issue of cultural critique, and we don't have a timeline for it yet because they have a couple other ones coming out, but they've approved it. And actually, we've also added some other people to the issue. Jana Hawkins Owen is going to be providing an essay, as is Ella, my colleague Ella Shabalo, who I actually have lots of good debates with around all this stuff, and she's wonderful. And Rebecca Sheldon. In fact, Ella and Rebecca are going to be the respondents to all the papers. So. Other questions? I do agree, Eric, that you could trace a similar, it'd be interesting to trace a similar argument through Spinoza and the kind of Deleuzian framework to thinking about the social too. I think that's also how the relationship of sex to the social, that seems valuable. But oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Justin. Other questions? Comments? Screeds? Jeremiah's? Yeah, no?
Well, let's see. Then is a link to the journal. I'll possibly drop in the chat. Yeah, I'll drop a link to the journal page in the chat. I guess then let's call it. Thanks again to all the panelists, and thanks to everybody who attended. Again, especially who got here at least Eastern time, 8:30 a.m. Chris and Kieran in Chicago are an hour behind, but if anyone is on the West Coast, then you definitely deserve some sort of award or badge. Okay, thanks everybody, and I'm looking forward to working with everyone on this panel in bringing this forward as the special issue that hopefully it materializes into.